again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Clarence. And when we think about history, we normally think about places long ago and far away. We don't often think about the history of the place where we actually live. So tonight we have with us a historian of Chicago. Actually, he's a Renaissance man from Chicago, but spends much of his time thinking and working with the history of the city we live in. Our guest tonight is Clarence Goodman. Clarence, welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. So let's start with the subject of Chicago history.
My favorite subject.
So I've heard. Why study Chicago? What got you interested?
Well, I guess it was absence making the heart grow fonder. You know, I went away to college. I left like when most people do when they're 18 or 19. And then I was gone for nearly 30 years. I only came back occasionally. And I moved back. My parents are getting older. It was time to come home. And I kind of lucked into a job with a tour company. And I wasn't doing much but listening. And I started to think, wow, I forgot how cool Chicago is. And I overheard somebody talking once about something happening at this spot. And then I went to my parents' house and I talked to them. And they just started sharing with me all of these stories that their parents shared with them about the Century in Progress World's Fair and the stories they heard, and both of my maternal grandparents coming here through during the Great Migration and that kind of thing. And it was like heroin. I have no social life. All I do is read and study about Chicago, and I think about Chicago constantly, and deservedly so. Chicago is the center of the universe.
Well, for those of us who live here, we certainly like to think so.
We do.
So it is interesting that you mentioned being gone for a long time, because I would imagine you can come back not just with a sense of where you grew up and a sense of home, but also the eyes of an outsider. So you now see it with a fresh perspective.
Excellent point, yes. Many times during my hiatus here, every time that I would come home and visit my parents, it wasn't like I was coming home, yeah, I know Chicago, I'm going to go down to Bridgeport, and I know where to get brats and all that stuff. I came as a tourist, and I forgot how to get any place. I forgot the difference between the blue line and the red line, and I was as ignorant as anybody walking around looking for Wabash Avenue. But
actually, when you left, it probably was not even called the blue line and the green line. They had different names.
You are correct. The Congress and the Ravenswood and all of that in the Jackson Park. Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And I don't know, you know, my mother always told me, I don't know where you get it from, but you know, somebody can say something to you once, except for doing your chores, and you remember it. I had a girlfriend say that I was kind of a history savant. And I started studying about Chicago, and then all of these things that must have been buried in my subconscious or whatever just kind of popped out. I was like, oh yeah, I know that. I knew that. Chicago's great. I want to talk about Chicago incessantly. And I do. I never get invited back to parties because I drive people crazy.
But I'm sure that your business as a tour guide must boom from your apparently encyclopedic knowledge of the city, right?
Yeah, I do all right.
So tell me about the tours. Where do you take people? What do you show them that are points of interest?
Well, I have many. Mine are historically oriented tours, and I avail my services in the form of a private guide. Mm-hmm. I no longer work for any companies. Many times it'll be kind of a public service, that kind of thing. I have I think close to 15 different tours that are historically oriented. For example, I'll do a true crime tour, which will be strictly Chicago during the beer wars. And it won't be like a company that will go unnamed where they dress up in pinstripe suits, even though I've got a pinstripe suit on, and do these fake accents and walk around with plastic Thompson submachine guns, the Chicago typewriter as it was called. It'll be, this happened here. And ultimately, as a historian, and I know you can appreciate this, a person can be like a Newt Gingrich and just spew out all of these dates. Fine. Why is it important? Why am I here? Why am I giving you my time? Why is it important enough that I stand here and you tell me about Chicago? That's my whole thing.
Well, I want to thank you for saying that, because one of my arguments with my history teachers way back in high school was, I don't really care so much about the exact dates. Don't make me memorize all these dates. Let's talk about the forces that were at work, what were the political forces, what were the social forces.
How it changed our society.
And yes, and how that leads to where we are today.
Exactly. That's what the most important question is why. It's not really necessarily the who, the what, the when, the where. I mean, all of those things obviously are factors, but why is it important, and how did it shape the trajectory and the course of where we are today? And that's what I'm about.
So what are some of the key inflection points in Chicago history where these kinds of factors came together and something changed that has influenced maybe not just the city, but even the country as a whole?
And the world. Industry. I mean, just the World's Columbian Exposition. And how many millions of Chicagoans go to the Museum of Science and Industry and not realize they're standing on hallowed ground. Speaking of I mean, from the introduction of yoga to America at the World's Fair in 1893, to Cracker Jack, to the first Ferris wheel, to the first movable sidewalk, to any number of different kinds of things. This was the world's first introduction to so many things. I mean, cream of wheat. Aunt Jemima made her first appearance at the World's Columbian Exposition. Just between the two World's Fairs, that one and the Century in Progress in 1933, Chicago changed the world, or the world altered its view of itself through the prism that was Chicago. I mean, the Second World's Fair was supposed to be 6 months. They detained it and kept it around for 2 years because it was so
popular. People
yes.
just kept coming to see it.
People kept coming to see it, and that's the first time anybody got a look at Sally Rand and her fan dance. John Dillinger paid, I think, $800 cash money for an 8-cylinder car at the World's Fair, which enabled him to run circles around cops for the rest of his career.
Because the police didn't have 8-cylinder cars.
Nor did they have too many Thompson submachine guns then. That was a gangster thing, starting off in the 20s. I mean, it was invented by General John Thompson.
Who was British or American?
He was American. John Thompson created the Thompson submachine gun, named it after himself, of course, in order to clean up the trenches during World War I. But of course, the war ended before he could market it. And the Army didn't want it because you retool after the war. So he sold them, he marketed them through hardware stores and catalogs and things like this. Cops didn't want them. Who wanted them? The 1920s?
The gangsters.
Gangsters. Most notably, not Al Capone, but rather his principal rival, Dean O'Banion, who was credited with bringing the Thompson submachine gun to Chicago. See, I love these tangents. We're talking about the World's Fair, and now we're talking about Dean O'Banion.
Well, history is nothing if not a set of interrelated factors, some of which are just purely coincidental, but the convergence is what leads to interesting events.
Yes.
So talk about some of the things that came out of those World's Fairs, besides like Sally Rand and the machine guns. It was about industry.
It was.
Right. And so Chicago has been a center of industry for a century or more.
For more than a century now. Probably the biggest industrial innovation in the first World's Fair was the deciding event, if you will, when deciding what kind of electricity you're going to use.
AC versus DC.
or DC, right. And many people don't realize and appreciate the war between Edison and Westinghouse. And Thomas Edison so hated the Westinghouse company that when they were coming up with a term to describe the process of electrocution, he wanted it to be termed, this man was Westinghoused in the electric chair, that kind of thing. So that was probably the most important one during the first World's Fair. And then the second World's Fair was much more compartmentalized or specific to Chicago. The second World's Fair in 1933 really showed the city what a great city it was for conventions, and thus was born the whole idea behind Chicago being Convention City. And they got the idea right there because, you know, the grounds for the Second World's Fair were roughly between the Field Museum and where we have Lake Meadows now, so about 2,000 south to about 3,500 south, which is a big chunk of real estate. They got this idea, this is perfect. So decades later, they got this idea for McCormick Place, because it would be this center hub on our beautiful lakefront. And this is another thing. Between the two World's Fairs, this was the opportunity for Chicagoans to see, wow, not only is our lakefront great for us, because we can go bathing and everything, but we can market this as America's third coast. And indeed they do.
Well, and that goes back to Burnham.
Right.
And his
Burnham.
plan for the lakefront,
Right.
which he recognized as a great resource.
Absolutely.
And convinced the city fathers, look, you need to exploit, well, not exploit, you need to preserve this.
Exploit is a good word, especially when it comes to Chicago.
Yes, it might be. So there were kinds of visionaries of all sorts, like Burnham, who saw the city as the lakefront as being such a natural resource, such a great draw for the city. And as I recall, he, though, by the way, was opposed fiercely by Frank Lloyd Wright, because they had very different ideas of what constituted modern architecture.
And Louis Sullivan, too. Louis Sullivan said that Burnham's designs and his whole idea of these neoclassical buildings made out of this stuff called staff were going to set American architecture back 50 years. But of course, this did not stop Louis Sullivan from taking a commission to do one of the buildings and constantly borrowing money from Burnham.
He had to work like everybody else,
He
right?
did have to work like everybody else. As an African American, one of the biggest sources of pride and interest when it comes to the World's Fairs for me is that with the World's Columbian Exposition, this was the first time that African Americans started to flood to Chicago, because everyone wanted to come to the White City. And many people from the South and the Midwest and so forth, they came to Chicago and they thought, wow, we can live here. Because they had no idea that just walking distance from the lakefront was Brownsville, where the beginnings of it. And so this really was the precursor for the migration. So when the boll weevil and Jim Crow kind of conspired to drive African Americans from the South, let's go to Chicago.
Well, plus there were jobs in Chicago.
Plus there were jobs in Chicago. And of course, that led to a number of revolutions, not the least of which was music, with all of those Delta blues guys and women coming up to Chicago.
Chess Records, a
Chess
famous
Records,
place.
A very famous place, but not just that. You know, the Chess building is still there, obviously, and it's a historic landmark. But just a few blocks from Chess, you've got the building where P Studio was. P Studio was where Roberta Flack recorded First Time I Ever Saw Your Face and Killing Me Softly. Anybody who's been in love knows the value of those songs. And then just a few blocks from that, you've got where VJ Records were. VJ Records, that was the first company in America to release a Beatle record, because Capitol wouldn't release the Beatles because they didn't think it would sell. And they were the first company to release the Four Seasons. Not only those, but the records that they specialize in, like Gene Chandler and other African-American groups and doo-wop groups.
And so, of course, Chicago today still has a reputation for being a center of music, though not quite the same. I mean, I think today we see the blues in particular preserved almost as a tourist attraction more than a really thriving artistic scene.
I agree.
So what's happened there? Well, how has the music scene in Chicago changed?
That is an excellent question. How do I put this delicately?
And I'll tell our audience that you yourself are a musician, so that you have a special perspective on this.
Where's the camera that's on? Yes. Anytime you have something in its purest essence, especially in America, when the masses get a hold of it, it tends to get watered down. And this is what originally happened to jazz music. It's what has happened to blues music. Many people say it's what's happened to country music and rock and so forth. And so, like you just eloquently pointed out, blues music has become less of a thriving scene unless you know what clubs to go to. And I'm not going to plug any. But it's more or less just this tourist attraction. People go to Buddy Guy's in hopes of bumping into Buddy Guy and going for authentic Chicago blues. And anybody who knows blues knows, well, that's not really where you go for authentic Chicago blues unless you happen to luck out that night. So really it's there, but you need to know where to look for it. I think the greatest thriving musical scene in Chicago, and this is going to sound ridiculous, But you go down in the stations, the subway stations, there are people there who are broke, who have threadbare clothes on. It looks like they have not bathed in a while, God bless them. And
But they can play.
Brilliant musicians and singers. And then you see some clown on a national television program, certainly not cable access, and they stink up the joint, and you listen to their record, and it's obviously auto-tuned and fixed and just a bunch of, as Stephen Still said, pap as opposed to pop music.
So let's talk a little bit more about the cultural scene in Chicago, because it's not just music, but Chicago has been a center for architectural development.
Absolutely.
The Art Institute is one of the great museums in the world.
Another relic, if you will, of the Columbian Exposition.
The theater scene, Second City, the Goodman Theater, Steppenwolf.
More known theaters in Chicago than any other city in the world, believe it or not. And that's, and when I say known, I mean from storefronts to garages to people just setting up a booth here and there. They're more in Chicago than any other city in the world.
And we have quite a few alumni from the city who have made it big. I mean, Bill Murray is the one who everyone probably thinks of first. But
I heard Gary Sinise on a television, or excuse me, a radio program earlier today, and I just saw a really bad movie a few moments ago that featured John Malkovich, one of his closest friends. Yeah. And you got the great Laurie Metcalf. You got a number of people. I mean, Chicago has a right to be proud. The sad thing is, as a person was pointing out, most people have to leave Chicago to become big stars.
Really
Betty
good.
White is from Oak Park, and she left at a very early age.
Actually, I did not know that. That's good to know.
Mel Torme left Chicago at an early age. Ricky Lee Jones, a bunch of Warren Zevon. The list goes on and on. But eventually, they find their way back, or we find them. You know.
In fact, even Bill Murray now lives in New York. Right?
Yes.
As much as he apparently lives anywhere, he seems to
pop
up everywhere. But
I heard he was moving to Inglewood. No, I'm just kidding.
So we've talked about industry and we've talked about the arts, but Chicago is also famous for labor history. So what happened here? Why is this important?
Well, I like to think, and I'm sure there's somebody out there watching who's forgotten more than I'll ever know about the labor movement. But from what I understand, the heart of the Industrial Revolution, because Chicago was the center of the continent and the center of the country, and we had, thanks to the advent of the IM Canal, we had this seamless waterway that just made Chicago this natural hub, and then the railways and so forth, that it just became this natural default of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, people who make money try to explain these political views are mine and are not Kevin's at all.
Well, they may or may not be, but we'll leave that for the audience to decide.
Yes, the audience decide. People who tend to make money in Western countries in industry, they take advantage until people say, no, you can't take advantage anymore. And so Chicago, the Black City as it was called, because the sky was filled with smoke and the buildings were covered with soot as a result of the Industrial Revolution, it was the perfect Aberdeen testing ground of how much people who owned property and industry could get away with, and what are we going to do to turn these rat sons of guns back and get our rights, get our 40-hour week, get our 8-hour day, limitations on the age of people who were working, exploitation of children, the exploitation of women, and obviously the exploitation of minority groups. And Chicago, being as small as it is physically, you know, I mean, today you cross the street and you've gone into a new neighborhood. You know.
It's often referred to as the city of neighborhoods.
Justifiably so.
And one of the things that struck me before the show, you and I were talking about the documentary City of the Century, and I think it was in that mentioned that the neighborhoods decades ago were tough places, and the German Catholics wouldn't go to an Irish Catholic church,
no.
or vice versa, or the Italians. Everyone stayed in their own neighborhood.
Lest you get hit in the head with a bottle.
Yes.
Which is, I'm glad you said that, because it leads to one of those great Chicago stories, and it's an American story. Legend has it that a German fellow walked into an Irish pub by mistake. He must have been in the cups a little bit already, and ordered, it was an Irish fellow walking into a German place, a little buzzed, and ordered a whiskey before hitting him in the head with a bottle, they gave him his whiskey and then they gave him a beer to back it up. So this is where the tradition of a shot and a beer was born, only in Chicago. We don't know if that story is true, but why let the truth get in the way of a good story?
Satchel Paige actually was quote. He may not have been the originator, but never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. I've heard that as a quote from Satchel Paige. So
let's give it to him because he was worth it.
He was.
The man so fast that he turned off the light and he was in bed before the room got dark. Did he say that? He said that about Cool Papa Bell. He said that about Cool Papa Bell. Yeah.
I think he had another one. Don't look back. Something might be gaining on you.
That's his most famous one because I think his memoir is entitled "Don't Look Back." Yeah. Ooh, he was quite a guy.
So let's continue talking about Chicago because since we live here, this is such a fascinating
subject.
Yes, fascinating topic. So if we go back to labor and the post-industrial revolution, that caused a lot of social changes as well, right? I mean, we have the Hull House as an example.
One of my heroes, Jane Addams.
So Jane Addams felt that then she needed to reach out to the working classes, which were largely looked down upon at that time. Well, I suppose you can.
And immigrants as well, yeah.
In some circles, they still are. But there was an attempt there to really change the way people thought. It was not this kind of structured elite versus everybody else society.
And the thing, and I'm glad you pointed that out. And one of the reasons she's one of my heroes or heroines, depending on your vernacular, is that she was not some middle-income girl. She could have been a dilettante, I mean, if she had wanted to. She was from the richest family in Cedarville, Illinois. Her father's best friend was a fellow by the name of Guiteau, whose son, Charles Guiteau, shot President Garfield. But that's just another one of those coincidences.
Yes.
But Jane Addams and her traveling companion, Ellen Starr Gates, they were mourning Jane's father's passing by taking a trip around the world, and they happened to be in England, in London, when Jack the Ripper, who may have been H.H. Holmes, that's a new theory that's been put forth, so we might have had someone who made his name in Chicago actually getting a start, but Jack the Ripper was going berserk and killing all of those women. And she was there in the Whitechapel district, and she looked at it, evaluated it, and said, "There but for the grace of God go I. These women didn't ask to be born into impoverished circumstances any more than I asked to be rich." So this was the epiphany she had as a result of seeing Jack the Ripper's works. And that's what sold her on the idea of coming back to Chicago and starting the Hull House.
Which was a remarkable place for its time, recognizing that culture and
much bigger than that one building that's still there.
Than it is today. Right. So we've seen a number of these kind of cultural shifts. Do you think in the future that Chicago can continue to play that kind of role in world history?
I think so. Now that we have had 2 consecutive mayors and a president who are heck-bent upon the world knowing that Chicago is the most important city in the world.
As we all know.
As we all know. I think that there might be, even though the city didn't get the Olympics, there might be a card or two up the sleeves of whoever's going to sit in the mayor's seat up on the 5th floor there at City Hall. Things we don't know about. I mean, it seems like Mayor Emanuel is trying to work out, broker tax agreements and so forth to stimulate the interest in Far Eastern monies and interests and so forth to not fly over the center of the world.
Stop here.
Stop here at Chicago.
Actually, maybe you can confirm for me one of the stories I had heard about stopovers or flyovers or drive-throughs, that in the early days with the railroads coming to Chicago, that the railroad barons here in the city mandated that the railroads could not connect in Chicago. They had to stop, and they had to offload from one railroad to the next because it forced the trains to stop here, and it forced the people riding the trains to get off and experience Chicago. And so they used that as a way to encourage people to spend time.
That's called marketing.
It was marketing, exactly.
And Mayor Daley wasn't even alive yet.
Right. They didn't allow the trains to run straight through. They made them stop here so that they could experience Chicago. And of course, back then, travel was much slower. Right. So if you were stopping, you would stop overnight. You might stop for a day. And so you would experience the city.
And this is so cool. I love how conversations meander. That's why in so many songs about taking the train and traveling, you almost always have a verse that includes stopping in Chicago, because indeed all trains stopped in Chicago. But then the dark side of that is, because of these forced stopovers, you had gentlemen employed as steerers around the Rock Island Station and around Central Station specifically, who would look for gullible young women. And they were compensated, and they would steer them to the Everlake Club or the Why Not Club or any of the hundreds of brothels that were less than a half a mile from Central Station. And these women were forcibly addicted to heroin and gang raped and forced into a life of prostitution.
How long did that period go on? When did that stop? Who cleaned it up?
That period went on a lot longer than most people realize. The Levee District, where all of those nice Tony condominiums and townhouses are now, where they were thinking of building the new Comiskey Park, that was in play before the Civil War. That whole area was filled with brothels and so forth before the Civil War. And the last of those places, the buildings anyway, were standing, well, most notably the Hotel Lexington, standing until the 1980s. The Hotel Lexington was the last of the most famous places there, and that was obviously one of the many hotels that Al Capone controlled.
So it lasted through Al Capone's time, and then was
well past Al Capone.
Past.
Al Capone, this is the amazing thing about Capone. Capone was 25 years old when he took over the rackets in Chicago. We see him depicted in movies as a man my age or older, in his early 50s. He was a kid, and the beer wars of Chicago, the shooting part of the beer wars of Chicago, really was only 5 years long. From the double crossing of Jaime Weiss, but of Johnny Torrio and Al Capone by Dino O'Banion, to Capone's incarceration 3 months after the St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929. That's a 5-year period.
So
that's a heartbeat.
His
and he
reign was only 5 years here in Chicago.
By the time he set himself up to get arrested after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, because he had made so many enemies, not the least of whom Lucky Luciano effectively said, "Hey man, you're messing it up for everybody. You're not really safe now." So 3 days after this huge summit of organized crime figures in Atlantic City, he set up his own arrest.
Feeling he'd be safer with the police.
And he was. He was arrested, ironically enough, for carrying a loaded pistol on his person. He hadn't carried a loaded pistol on his person since he had inadvertently shot himself in the scrotum a few years. We can say scrotum on...
Yeah, we can say that. And that would definitely change your behavior now, wouldn't
it? And your wardrobe, too, and
yes.
your walk. Yeah. And then by the time he got out of jail for that, which was about a year, he slid back into the rackets, but the winds had changed, and a fellow by the name of George E.Q. Johnson, not Elliot Ness. Elliot Ness did very little. George E.Q. Johnson, the U.S. attorney in Chicago, was really the man who put Capone in jail.
And for tax evasion, of all things.
Tax evasion, of all things, yes.
So we only have about 30 seconds left.
Oh, wow.
What do you think would be the one thing that you feel most strongly about Chicago, its greatest trait that we think will take us into the rest of the 21st and the 22nd century?
All points lead to Chicago. All things lead from Chicago. Everything that everybody in the whole world does today has some tie to Chicago, good or bad. From every major assassination in American history nearly having something to do with Chicago, to the crown points of industry having something to do with Chicago, to innovations. The Forward Pass was created in Chicago.
Well, on that note then, tantalizing as it is, if you always want to leave the audience wanting more, we'll want to have you back and have you talk some more.
I'd love to.
But we're out of time for tonight. Clarence,
thank you so much
for being here. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night on Comcast Channel 19 at 8 o'clock. And you can also see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. Till next time, thank you and good night. Okay, so stay seated.